The sun scorched the cracked earth of Red Hollow, a forgotten speck of a town where dust clung to everything, and the saloon's crooked sign creaked in the dry wind, its shadow falling over Clara, a 12-year-old girl bound to a splintered fence post behind the weathered building. Her wrists, thin as willow branches, burned red from the coarse rope biting into her skin, and her bare feet sank into the cool mud, the only relief against the heat that pressed her tattered muslin dress to her small frame, damp and clinging, like a second skin. She stood silent, her dark eyes fixed on the ground, her face hollowed by hunger and something deeper, a resignation that made her seem older than her years. The crowd around her buzzed with coarse laughter, men spitting tobacco into the dirt, their attention split between whiskey shots, card games, and the girls upstairs, though a few lingered near Clara, their gazes sharp with curiosity or a hunger. That made her stomach twist. Amos Reed, her father, leaned against the saloon's peeling wall, his gambler's grin crooked, his breath sour with cheap liquor as he hawked her to settle his debts, his voice slurring as he called out $10 for her, offering a week's labor or permanent ownership, whatever suited the buyer. No one asked her name, and Clara didn't offer it, her silence a shield forged from years of being traded like a chipped poker piece. Across the street, Elias Boone, a widower of 45, rode into town on a weary mare, his worn coat flapping against his lean frame, his only plan to trade furs for nails and salt to keep his struggling ranch alive. His life had been whittled down by loss, his wife Ruth taken by fever 5 years back, their unborn child buried with her in his heart, his land barely holding against debt and storms. But as he passed the alley, his mare slowed without command, and his eyes caught Clara, her trembling arms stretched above her head, her cheeks sunken like she'd forgotten the taste of hope. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching in the dirt, and stood at the alley's edge, his jaw tightening as Amos tugged the rope, boasting she could clean, cook, and wouldn't talk back, his words slithering through the crowd like a snake. The onlookers shifted, some turning away, the scene too raw even for Red Hollow's hard heart. But Elias felt a pull, a memory of Ruth's quiet strength, her hands mending his shirts, her voice promising better days. He stepped forward, his voice low but cutting through the noise, offering $15, not to buy Clara but to clear Amos's debt, his eyes locked on the gambler, daring him to argue. Amos laughed, a hollow sound, and tossed the rope into the dust, shrugging as if shedding a worn-out coat. Elias knelt before Clara, his pocket-knife slicing through the ropes, her wrists falling limp as she staggered, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, wary, hollow, but flickering with something alive like a spark buried in ash. He didn't speak, didn't ask her to follow, just led her to his mare, setting her on a borrowed mule with loose reins, her small hands gripping the saddle horn as if it might vanish. They rode out of town, the dust swirling behind them like a fading curse, the sky bruising purple over the horizon, Elias's heart heavy with questions he couldn't voice, wondering what he'd just brought into his solitary life. Clara, her face turned from the road, clutched the mule's reins, her silence louder than the wind whistling through the canyon, her mind racing with the fear that freedom might be just another trap. The town shrank behind them, its noise swallowed by the vastness of the plains, and Elias glanced back once, seeing Clara's shoulders hunched but steady, a girl who'd learned too young to carry her own weight. He didn't know her story, didn't need to yet, but the weight of her presence settled into him, a quiet promise that something broken might still be mended, if only they could outrun the shadows trailing them. The sun scorched the cracked earth of Red Hollow, a forgotten speck of a town where dust clung to everything, and the saloon's crooked sign creaked in the dry wind, its shadow falling over Clara, a 12-year-old girl bound to a splintered fence post behind the weathered building. Her wrists, thin as willow branches, burned red from the coarse rope biting into her skin, and her bare feet sank into the cool mud, the only relief against the heat that pressed her tattered muslin dress to her small frame, damp and clinging, like a second skin. She stood silent, her dark eyes fixed on the ground, her face hollowed by hunger and something deeper, a resignation that made her seem older than her years. The crowd around her buzzed with coarse laughter, Men spitting tobacco into the dirt, their attention split between whiskey shots, card games, and the girls upstairs. Though a few lingered near Clara, their gazes sharp with curiosity or a hunger that made her stomach twist. Amos Reed, her father, leaned contained artifact content truncated for brevity. Full content available in the artifact. Elias Boone's ranch sprawled across a quiet valley 12 miles west of Red Hollow, a patchwork of sagging fences and cottonwood. Trees stripped bare by an early frost, the cabin's leaky roof groaning under the weight of last week's rain. Clara, still a stranger to him, sat rigid on the borrowed mule as they approached, her small hands clutching the reins, her eyes scanning the horizon like a deer waiting for the snap of a twig. Elias led the way, his mare's hooves kicking up. Red dust, his own heart uneasy with the weight of this girl he'd freed but didn't know how to care for. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of damp wood and old coffee, the sparse room lit by a single oil lamp flickering on a scarred table. Elias pointed to a cot by the fireplace, a wool blanket folded neatly atop it, and said it was hers, his voice gruff but not unkind. Clara stood frozen, her bare feet leaving muddy prints on the floor, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting it to slam shut. He ladled beans into a dented tin bowl, set it before her and said she could eat. But she stared at the spoon like it might bite, her fingers trembling as she lifted it, tasting warmth she hadn't known in years. When she whispered a thank. Her voice was small, like it had been buried under floorboards, and Elias realized she didn't know what it meant to sit and eat without fear. He told her the doors didn't lock, that she was safe, but her nod was hesitant, her body curled tight as if braced for a blow. The next morning, she woke before dawn, no bell or shout needed, her instincts sharp from years of guessing what kept punishment at bay. Elias was outside splitting kindling by the shed, his coat slung over one shoulder, each axe strike ringing through the canyon. Clara hesitated at the porch, unsure if she needed permission to step forward, then moved. Silently to the chicken coop, scattering corn from a sack, her hands red from the cold. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how she worked without complaint, her movements precise but guarded, like she was proving her worth to stay. By noon, she'd swept the porch, the broom's rhythm steady, her eyes flicking to the road every few minutes, watching for someone to come reclaim her. Elias baked bread that day, a weekly ritual, though his loaves came out hard as stones, and he set a piece on her plate with a spoonful of honey, pretending not to notice her hesitation. She tore off a small bite, asked if she should save it, and he said there'd be more, his voice softer than he meant, stirring a memory of his late wife Ruth, who'd once filled this house with warmth. Clara ate slowly, her face flinching at the sweetness, and Elias turned to the window, his chest tight with an ache he couldn't name. A neighbor, Sarah Wells, rode by that afternoon, her horse kicking up dust as she asked about the girl, her tone curious but kind. Elias deflected, saying it was none of her concern, his protectiveness surprising him, though Sarah's raised eyebrow told him the town was already whispering. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her knees pulled to her chest, and began humming a faint off-key tune, the sound so soft Elias almost missed it. He stayed still, not wanting to break the moment, the first sign of life in her beyond survival. She stopped abruptly, as if caught, and retreated to her cot, curling under the blanket like she could disappear. Elias stepped outside to check the mule, the stars sharp above the ridge, and wondered what kind of life he'd stumbled into, bringing a girl with no name into a home that hadn't felt like one since Ruth's death. The coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carrying a loneliness he knew too well, and he glanced back at the cabin where Clara's small form lay still, her presence both a burden and a strange kind of hope. Spring crept into the valley, its tentative green softening the harsh lines of Elias Boone's ranch, where cottonwoods sprouted delicate buds and the earth smelled of renewal after a long winter. Clara, now a quiet presence in the cabin, began to unfold like the season, her guarded silence giving way to small acts of trust that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. One evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls, she approached Elias with a scrap of paper, her handwriting shaky but deliberate, spelling out her name, Clara, a declaration of her existence that landed like a vow in the quiet room. Elias nodded, slipping the paper into his pocket, his weathered face softening as he saw her eyes spark with something new, not quite hope, but a fierce claim to her own identity. Their days settled into a rhythm of shared labor, Clara shadowing Elias as he mended the fence line, her small frame navigating the rocky terrain with determination. Her hands blistered from carrying water buckets, but never pausing to complain. One afternoon she found one of his torn shirts and sat cross-legged by the fire, stitching it with uneven but careful threads, her focus so intense Elias paused on the porch, struck by a memory of Ruth's hands moving with the same quiet purpose. He decided to teach her to ride the mule, steadying her as she gripped the reins. Her body tense until she found her balance, and when he tripped over a gnarled root during the lesson, her laugh burst out, sharp, unguarded, a sound so rare it startled them both. Clara clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide as if joy were forbidden, but Elias grinned, saying it was about time she remembered how to laugh, the moment hanging between them like a fragile thread. One morning she wandered to the barn and found Ruth's unmarked grave, a weathered stone smoothed by time, and placed a dried wildflower there, its brittle petals laid with such reverence that Elias, catching sight of it, felt his throat tighten, realizing Clara knew loss in a way she'd never voiced. That night, he shared a story of Ruth's love for planting herbs, how she'd hum softly while tending them, her voice filling the house with warmth, and Clara listened, knees pulled to her chest, absorbing his words like they were seeds for something new. But whispers from Red Hollow slithered to the ranch, carried by Jacob Holt, a wiry tinker with a gambler's glint who'd once diced with Amos Reed. His cart rattled up the path one afternoon, and he spotted Clara fetching water from the creek, his eyes lingering too long as he asked Elias if she was hired help or kin, his tone probing like a knife testing a seam. Elias's voice turned to iron, ordering Jacob to leave, but Clara overheard, her hands tightening on the bucket, fear flickering as she wondered if he'd drag her back to her father's world. Elias met her gaze, promising no one would take her, and she nodded, though her shoulders stayed tense, her trust still a fragile thing. The next day, Clara tried baking cornbread, her first attempt, the edges charred but the center soft, and she set a piece on Elias's plate, watching him chew with a mix of pride and nerves. He said it wasn't half bad, and her smile, small but real, lit the cabin brighter than the fire. She began humming again, a halting tune only when she thought Elias wasn't near, and he pretended not to hear, letting her find her voice in her own time. On a walk to check traps by the creek, she stumbled on a rock, scraping her knee and gritted her teeth, refusing his offer of a cloth until he pressed it into her hand, saying it wasn't weak to hurt. That night, by the fire, Clara asked about Ruth's grave, her voice barely a whisper, and Elias admitted Ruth had lost a child too, his words heavy with a grief he rarely spoke. Clara stayed silent, but lingered by the fire longer than usual, her presence a quiet anchor in the cabin's stillness, and Elias felt something shift, not healing, but a step toward it, as if her courage was stitching something new into his. Days. Outside, the hills bloomed with wildflowers, and Clara, pausing to pick one, tucked it into her braid, a fleeting claim to beauty in a world that had offered her so little, her small acts of defiance and care weaving a bond neither could yet name. A week later, the air over Elias Boone's ranch turned heavy with the threat of trouble. The horizon smudged with dust as 3 riders approached, their shadows long and sharp against the morning sun. Clara, kneading dough in the cabin, paused, her hands dusted with flour, sensing the change before she saw it, her instincts honed by years of watching for danger. Elias, mending a harness by the barn, spotted them first. Reverend Lyle, a preacher with a stiff collar and colder eyes, Deputy Cole, his badge glinting like a warning, and Amos Reed, Clara's father, his gambler's smirk curling under a hat stained with sweat. They dismounted at the gate, their boots deliberate in the dirt, and Elias set the harness down, his hand brushing the knife at his belt, his heart steady but wary. Reverend Lyle stepped forward, folding his hands as if in prayer, but his voice cut sharp, declaring Clara was legally Amos's property, bound by a gambling debt contract filed in Red Hollow's courthouse. Amos, leaning on a fence post, sneered that Elias had no claim, calling Clara a debt to be collected, his words dripping with the same cruelty that had once tied her to a saloon post. Deputy Cole, hand resting near his pistol, added that harboring her was theft, demanding proof of guardianship or her return by sundown. Elias stood taller, his voice low but unyielding, saying Clara was no one's property, a child who ate and slept free under his roof, and he'd see them in hell before letting her go back. He demanded they bring legal papers within 7 days, his eyes locked on Amos, who spat in the dirt and laughed, saying time wouldn't change the law. Clara, unnoticed until now, stepped onto the porch, her braid neat, her apron smudged, her small frame rigid but her gaze fierce, no longer the cowering girl from weeks ago. She stared at Amos, her voice steady despite a slight tremble, saying she wasn't his to take, her words slicing through the tension like a blade. The men flinched, unaccustomed to defiance from someone so young, and Reverend Lyle's pious mask slipped, his tone turning sharp as he urged Clara to come willingly, promising a return to her rightful place. She didn't move, her eyes flicking to Elias, who stepped between her and the men, his presence a wall of quiet resolve. Deputy Cole's hand twitched, but Elias's stare held him, and he backed off, muttering about legal consequences. The trio mounted their horses, dust swirling as they rode off, but their threat lingered like smoke, promising a return. Clara turned to Elias, her voice soft but certain, asking if they'd come back, and he nodded, saying they had 7 days to prepare. She walked back inside, adding the task to her mental list with the same calm she used for feeding chickens. But her hands shook as she resumed kneading, betraying the fear she wouldn't voice. Elias sent a letter to a lawyer friend in Junction Bluff, an old army comrade who might help, though he knew the law moved slower than a lame mule out here. That evening he sat Clara down by the fire, pulling his rifle from its rack, not to scare her but to teach her its weight, showing her how to hold it steady, saying it wasn't for shooting but for knowing she wasn't helpless. Her small hands gripped the stock, her face set with a determination that made Elias's chest ache, seeing a strength in her he hadn't expected. She asked what he'd do if they took her voice barely above a whisper, and he met her gaze, saying he'd fight, the words sealing a bond neither had named but both felt. The next day Clara worked harder, scrubbing the table until it gleamed, as if order could keep the threat at bay, while Elias reinforced the barn door, his hammer strikes echoing with purpose. At night they sat in silence, the fire crackling, and Clara read from an old almanac, her lips moving silently, as if words could anchor her. Elias watched, his thoughts drifting to the lawyer's response, knowing it might not come in time, but feeling a resolve he hadn't known since Ruth's death. The ranch, once a hollow shell, now hummed with a shared purpose, Clara's defiance and Elias's protectiveness weaving a fragile shield against the coming storm, the valley quiet but tense, waiting for the next move. On the 6th day, as the valley held its breath under a pale dawn, a rickety wagon creaked up the path to Elias Boone's ranch, driven by a woman whose face bore the weight of too many sorrows. Clara, sweeping the porch, froze mid-motion, her broom clattering to the ground as she whispered, "Mama," her voice a fragile thread stretched across years of loss. Hannah, no older than 30 but weathered like driftwood, stepped down, her thin frame leaning on a carved cane, her eyes sunken but alive with a desperate hope, as she dropped the cane and fell to her knees, clutching Clara so tightly the girl gasped. Tears streaked Hannah's face as she choked out that she'd thought Clara was dead, sold off by Amos Reed to settle his debts, her words breaking under the guilt of leaving her daughter behind. Clara, her own eyes dry but wide, clung back, her fingers digging into her mother's ragged shawl, then glanced at Elias, seeking his quiet strength as if to anchor this reunion. Hannah explained she'd reclaimed a small homestead near Cotton Bend, a shack barely standing but hers, and she'd come to bring Clara home, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and fear that it might not last. Elias, standing back, felt like an outsider in this moment, his hands shoved into his pockets, but Clara turned to him, introducing her mother with a small, proud smile, saying he'd kept her safe. Hannah stood on shaky legs, her gaze meeting Elias's, gratitude mixing with wariness, and she asked if he'd help them settle at the homestead just for a day or two to make it livable. Elias nodded, unable to say no to Clara's hopeful eyes, and by noon they were packed, the wagon rattling toward Cotton Bend, Clara and Hannah in the back, Elias walking beside the mule, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The homestead appeared. At dusk, a slant-roofed shack leaning against a rocky ridge, its walls patched with tin and timber, a bent windmill creaking in the breeze, the air thick with pine sap. Inside it was swept clean but sparse, a single cot and a table holding a few jars, a child's drawing of a woman and a girl tacked to the wall with a rusty nail, its colors faded but precious. Hannah touched it, whispering she'd kept it through. Everything. And Clara's breath caught, seeing proof of her mother's love. Elias worked silently, starting a fire with his flint stacking wood, while Clara and Hannah arranged what little they had, their movements hesitant but growing surer. That night, they ate beans and flatbread Clara cooked, Hannah dozing from exhaustion, murmuring that it smelled like home. Elias slept outside, under a sky pricked with stars, his thoughts heavy with the realization that Clara might leave him, the cabin's quiet warmth fading without her. But before dawn, a sharp scent woke him. Smoke, not from a hearth, but wild and hungry, curling from the western ridge where an orange glow flickered. He ran to the shack, shouting for Clara and Hannah, who stumbled out, Clara barefoot, staring at the horizon as she said, "It's moving fast." Elias scanned the trees, toting the wind pulling the fire east, and warned that if it jumped the canyon it'd reach them by dusk. Hannah coughed, her voice breaking as she asked what to do, and Elias said they had to run, but Clara hesitated, her eyes on a tiny shed beside the shack, whispering about her mother's papers and her books inside. Elias made the choice, sprinting to the shed, its padlock no match for his knife, and grabbed a trunk of linens, a bundle of herbs, and a small stack of books, stuffing them into his coat as ash began to drift down like snow. They fled in the wagon, the mule straining as the fire crowned the ridge, trees screaming as they burned, the valley choking in smoke. By afternoon, the homestead was gone, its walls consumed, and they reached a creek where the water ran clear. Camping under a rocky overhang, Hannah wept, her hands covering her face, but Clara, clutching the rescued books, said quietly, "It took everything again," her voice steady despite the loss. Elias handed her the drawing from the wall, miraculously intact, and she held it to her chest, a faint smile breaking through. They made coffee from the last of their grounds, the silence heavy but shared, and Clara sat close to Elias, saying she'd thought the homestead would heal them, but it hadn't. He replied that healing wasn't a place, but what they carried. Together, his words slow and deliberate, and she nodded, leaning against Hannah, who slept exhausted beside her. The fire's glow faded in the distance, and Elias watched Clara's face in the firelight, her strength a quiet mirror to his own, their bond deepening in the face of loss, the creek's murmur a promise that something could still grow from the ashes. The morning after the fire, Elias, Clara, and Hannah returned to the ranch, the valley air still thick with the acrid scent of charred wood, only to find the fence posts smoldering, the ground scarred with boot prints, and the word "thief" scrawled in charcoal across the cabin door. Elias's jaw tightened as he traced the damage. Furniture overturned, Ruth's old rocking chair hacked to splinters, his ledger and rifle stolen. Knowing Amos Reed and his allies had struck while they were gone, their vengeance as deliberate as a snakebite. Clara, stepping down from the wagon, stood unflinching, her 12-year-old frame small but resolute, her eyes scanning the wreckage, not with fear, but with a quiet fury, saying they wanted her scared, but she wasn't running anymore. Hannah, trembling from the journey, clutched the saddle, her face pale with a dread she couldn't voice, but Clara's words steadied her, and she nodded, joining the effort to salvage what remained. Elias began clearing debris, his hammer strikes, ringing with purpose as he rebuilt the front step, while Clara spread damp hay to dry, and Hannah righted chairs, sweeping broken glass into a bucket with shaking hands. By noon, Sarah Wells arrived, her horse laden with nails and planks, her face set with a neighbor's quiet loyalty, saying word had spread about Elias's stand, and some folks thought he'd done right by Clara. Behind her came 3 others, one with wire, another with a pot of stew, their presence a silent vote of support, no questions asked. They worked together, the valley humming with the sound of hammers and voices, rebuilding what Amos had tried to break. Clara, watching from the porch, her arms folded, kept her eyes on the road, as if daring trouble to return. Near sundown, Amos rode up alone, his smirk sour, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he dismounted, taunting Elias about the party and claiming Clara was still his by-law, marked as property without papers. Elias stepped forward, his voice steady, saying she was no one's property, but before he could finish, Clara strode off the porch, her small hand flashing out to slap Amos hard across the face, the crack echoing through the hills. The workers paused, eyes wide, as Amos's cheek burned red, his sneer faltering under Clara's glare, her voice low but clear, saying he didn't get to speak of her mother or claim her anymore. Elias stood beside her, calling her brave, not wild, his words a shield as he faced Amos, noting the man's hand hovering near his belt, but stopping short, outnumbered by the neighbor's watchful eyes. Amos mounted his horse, spitting a promise of regret. But Elias replied he'd regret nothing, his certainty a wall the gambler couldn't breach. As Amos rode off, Clara's hands shook, and she admitted to Elias she'd been scared but hadn't run, her voice soft but proud. He nodded, saying she didn't need to, and the weight of her courage settled into him like a stone smoothed by a river. That night they ate together by the fire, the stew warm, the bread soft, and Hannah sang a lullaby from some distant memory, her voice cracked but tender, Clara resting her head on her mother's shoulder without flinching. Elias watched, his chest loosening for the first time in years, letting himself close his eyes for a moment without fear of what the dark might bring. Later, as the fire burned low, Clara asked if he thought she was still broken, her voice small but searching. Elias rose, fetched Ruth's old carving knife from the cabinet, and handed it to her, saying it wasn't about being broken but what she did after, his words heavy with truth. Clara took the knife, its blade catching the firelight, and smiled. Not because she was whole, but because she was no longer hiding. Days turned to weeks and the ranch grew stronger, the fence rebuilt, the cabin warmed by shared meals. Clara carved her name into a new fence post, a quiet claim to her place, and Hannah, finding strength in her daughter's fire, began to laugh again, her voice mingling with Clara's as they worked. Years later, Clara rode into Red Hollow with her own wagon, her name on the ledger as Clara Boone, not because Elias had adopted her legally, but because the town knew her as his, her bread and stories woven into its heart. The scars of Amos's threats faded, and the fire's ash gave way to new growth, the valley blooming with wildflowers that Clara still tucked into her braid. Elias, older now, sat on the porch, watching her ride off, knowing she'd saved him as much as he'd saved her. Their family forged not by blood, but by choice, a bond stronger than any law Amos could wield. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the ranch stood firm, a testament to what grows when you refuse to let the past burn you down.